Woohoo! Gonna be reading this. The Stone Flower. Oh my goodness, should take better care. Bar care. Once and for all. On 12 February 1578, the Portuguese galleon Nossa Senhora de Coimbra was hopelessly adrift off the southwestern coast of Africa. She had left Goa 3 months before with rotten sails and a defective rudder. At the mercy of God to save 4 crusaders, as the saying was among the sailors. Off the Cape of Good Hope she had been struck by a southeasterly gale and had run before it. The rudder lost 3 pintles and was swept away. A new rudder was made, and with this she limped up the coast for 17 days until another gale smashed it to pieces and ripped out her foremast. In heavy seas and thick fog she was set remorselessly towards the shore. The littoral of southern Africa at this point is a strange and ghostly place. A cold desert, beset by dank fog and icy seas. Great white dunes and massive black rocks give way to harsh scrub desert, and it is only after one has penetrated 50 miles into the interior that the fog dissipates and the heat is felt. Nossa Senhora da Coimbra was a vessel of 180 tons carrying a cargo of silks, cloth of gold, spices, carpets from Cambodia, and odias, and mats from the Maldives. Also, hamburgers, tortoiseshell, mother-of-pearl, coral, diamonds from Golconda, pearls from Ceylon, as well as caskets inlaid with ivory and filled with incense. Her passengers, also Portuguese, who had embarked at Cochin and Goa, numbered with her crew 153. There were also 194 black slaves, making a total of 347 souls in all. Her captain was a tough seaman born in Sagres in southern Portugal, who had been brought up on stories of Prince Henry the Navigator. His name was Manuel de Sá, and as a youth he had often sailed in the rough seas of Cape Saint Vincent. He had made the voyage between Lisbon and India twice before, yet even he was frightened as he had never been. Had there only been some let-up in the wind or the fog, or both, something might have been done to help the ship. But when the wind slackened, the fog increased, and when the fog lifted, the wind blew a gale. At one point, when the wind had lessened and the fog had returned, most of the passengers were either below or kneeling on the afterdeck, where they were being led in prayers by a Dominican monk. The crew, as well as many of the black slaves, strained their eyes into the fog banks, trying to penetrate the grey walls. Manuel de Sar had had little rest for more than 3 weeks, but he also stared into the fog. His tired eyes saw visions of angels in a golden light, and he knew that he was going to die. At noon, one of the sailors reported hearing surf. An attempt was made to veer the ship, but without a rudder and a foremast, this proved impossible. So instead, the ship's boat was made ready. At 1:22 p.m., the vessel struck a reef of low black rocks and began to make water. Soon afterwards, the pumps broke down, choked with pepper from the holes. The Dominican monk, Friar Francis of the Rosary, wrote an account of what happened next, and thus forms what has become known as the Chronicle of the Wreck of Nossa Senhora de Coimbra. One of several chronicles which exist telling of wrecks on the African coast, such as those of the Soa Thom, the Soa Joa, Nossa Senhora de Belém, and the Santo Alberto. Within the ship, nothing was heard but sighs, groans, wailing, moans, and prayers to God for mercy, wrote Friar Francis. In the twin decks, it seemed as if all the evil spirits were busy. So great a noise was made by the things that were floating about, striking each other and washing from side to side in such a way that those who went below fancied they beheld the likeness of the Last Judgment. The ship's boat was launched, and 104 people, including sailors, scrambled into it. The number was such that there was almost no free board. One of the survivors in the boat was a woman, Leona de Mendoca, a widow on her way home who had already lost her 2-year-old daughter in the rough seas. She was hysterical and could not be made to sit, but stood up, screaming and tearing her clothes until she threatened the lives of the others. A sailor caught her by the hair and threw her into the sea. As the ship's boat made for the shore, the cries of those on the doomed galleon and of those drowning in the swell were pitiful to hear. But when anyone tried to clamber aboard, the sailors smashed their fingers and pushed them away with oars. One man, Bernardino de Carvalho, formerly captain of His Majesty's dockyard in Goa, offered 10,000 cruzados for a place in the boat. His offer was accepted by the sailors and he was hauled aboard. He was very fat and should have floated, but he wore a magnificent brocade coat patterned with gold and silver thread and decorated with glass buttons, which had become waterlogged and threatened to pull him down. Once he was in the boat, 2 black slaves were thrown into the sea to make the weight equal to what it had been. Whoa, whoa! The sailor in charge was named Bartolomeo Bartolomeo Barreto, and he had been born and bred like a rat in the Tagus docks. He was a heavy man with a knife scar running down one side of his head. It was he who had thrown the woman and the slaves into the sea. He stood at the steering oar as the boat moved into the Atlantic surf. The waves were curling and booming, and the fog made the task more hazardous. But Barreto had seawater in his veins, and he held hard and called the stroke to the oars. They came in on the back of a wave, slid forward before it broke, and sped down the hill of green water ahead of the creaming foam. Women screamed and men prayed, but Barreto held on, and soon the impetus slackened and the boat was carried onto a shore of clean white sand. Of the original 347 passengers and crew, 138 survived the wreck. Of these, 20 were to die of their injuries within a day or two. The water was stained red with the blood of the bodies that were washed ashore. Some had been smashed against the rocks so badly that they were no longer recognizable. Others reached the beach with their wounds. One man, a factor from Cochin, had splintered his right leg and marrow dripped onto the sand. He died soon afterwards. Late in the day, a westering sun burned away the fog, and the survivors could see where they were. It was a bleak prospect. A steep white beach broken by tongues and outcrops of black rock stretched away on either side as far as the eye could see. The ship, her masts, sails, and rigging hanging over her sides made a melancholy picture. Waves battered her and her planking snapped with the sound of pistol shots. The survivors held a service of thanksgiving on the beach, and a crucifix was tied to a lance which was pushed into the sand. The sight of it calmed many people. Friar Francis led them in prayers, and when the service was over, the foot collected what he had washed ashore from the wreck. Soon there grew on the beach a little village of tents made from carpets and mats and silk hangings and cloth of gold. A strong current which ran parallel with the beach had swept many people southwards. Most perished, but some survived, and these came into the camp in ones and twos during the next few days. The captain had not been seen since the ship had run on the rocks, and in his absence, and in the absence of any other officer, leadership had been assumed by Barreto, who had a following among the sailors. With great skill and courage, he took the ship's boat back to the wreck before she broke up completely and brought to the beach some casks of flour and pickled beef. He and a dozen seamen made 4 visits to Nossa Senhora de Coimbra before she was finally smashed to pieces. Each time they landed on the beach, the survivors cheered. Barreto placed 2 sailors with muskets to guard the stores. They found a spring of sweet water, and this, too, was guarded. It was only then that the survivors learned that the food and water were not to be rationed among them, but were for sale only. A cup of water cost 10 cruzados, a kettle holding 6 quarts, 100, half a pound of meat, 15, a mug of flour, 10. A dead shark was washed ashore on the third day, and Barreto and his men cut it up and sold slices to 2 inches thick for 15 cruzados each. Half its head fetched 20,000 reis. The whole shark brought in as much as a good farm cost in Portugal. Some of the survivors had been wealthy merchants in Cochin and Goa and had brought with them their money and jewels in body belts and so were able to pay these prices. Others had lost everything in the wreck and would have died of thirst had they not received water from those more fortunate. For food, they scavenged along the beach, cutting black mussels from the rocks. Once they saw a pile of empty shells in a small rock cave, and Friar Francis said that bears had feasted there. But there are no bears in Africa. What they had seen were signs of other human beings, a small group of Strandlooper Hottentots, beach walkers, who had wandered along this shore 8 years before on a journey southwards. On the afternoon of the 8th day, the captain walked into the camp. He had been washed down the coast in the strong current, and had been on the point of drowning when a wave had cast him ashore. He had lain at the tide line for a day before regaining consciousness, and was so disorientated that he had wandered south along the beach instead of north. But by doing so he had come upon the mouth of a river. He had walked inland for a time surveying the country, and had then set off to search for other survivors. It did not take him long to discover how things were with Barreto and the dozen surviving sailors. Manuel de Sá was a short, tough man with bandy legs and a strong, wiry body, and was afraid of no one. But one does not become captain of a galleon without brains, and he knew the passengers who might support him would be no match for armed sailors. So he bided his time until he could speak quietly with Barreto and ask what he planned. The sailor had no plans. He was, for the first time in his life, wealthy beyond dreaming. He could not think farther than that. Having heard him, the captain asked Friar Francis to hold a service, and when prayers were over, he addressed the survivors. He told them that on the east coast of Africa, the opposite side from where they were now, there was the Portuguese settlement of Lourenço Marquês, and if they crossed Africa almost due east, they would come to it. He thought the distance was less than 2,000 leagues. He went on to say that ships called occasionally at Lourenço Marquês, but that here on the west coast nothing was ever seen of a vessel unless it was a wreck like theirs. Barreto and the sailors stood to one side, listening. Then Barreto said, "How would we get there? Walk. 2,000 leagues? It can be done." He told them of other wrecks, the Sawa Yoa and the Sawa Bento, which had foundered on the east coast of Africa and whose survivors had walked to safety. He did not tell them how few had reached their destination. Those who were strong enough to contemplate so great a journey cheered the captain, but Barreto looked on with hostility. There was still a great deal of money and jewels to be won from them, and he was content where he was. But the mood was against him. Anything was better than dying on this bleak and foggy beach. "What about water?" Barreto said. "I have been inland. It is nothing but desert." The captain told them of the river he had seen. On 22nd February 1578, the survivors began the long journey, leaving behind only an elderly man with a broken leg who had no money and a black slave boy whose right foot had been smashed. All the women could pay and were carried in litters made from planking which had been washed ashore. The former captain of Gower Dockyard, Bernardino de Cavallo, had bought the help of 4 men for 20,000 cruzados. They had made a hammock out of the ship's rigging and fastened it to 4 carrying poles, in which he lay back in his glass-bottomed coat and closed his eyes. The river along which they made their way is now called the Orange. It winds its way into the heart of southern Africa. Then, no one had named it, but to the few bands of wandering Hottentots and Bushmen, it was known as the Rio. It flows through some of the most hostile terrain in the world. Gorges of great rocks, burning hot to the touch, are followed by mile upon mile of stony, desiccated country where the scorpion and the snake are king. The heat is immense, and February is often the worst month with temperatures reaching 112 degrees during the day and dropping only to the middle 90s at night. In the 16th century it was an empty land, still to wake from its long sleep. Although Portuguese navigators had rounded the Cape of Good Hope 100 years before in their search for India, they had not colonized it. Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh man. What the? Where was I? Okay, the Dutch, who would were not due for more than 60 years. Little bands of Bushmen and Hottentots, the original people of the country, occasionally wandered through it, but their permanent homes were hundreds of miles to the south, and they had yet to be driven north by invading colonists. The Black Bantu were 1,000 miles away. Progress was slow. In the first month, the party covered less than 100 miles and lost more than half its number. People died of a variety of causes, some in accidents on the steep sides of gorges, some of heat stroke, some of sunstroke, some of scurvy, some of the bloody flux, and some of starvation. Many died from simple misery. Because some were stronger than others and traveled more quickly, the party soon strung out over a distance of more than 3 miles. At its head walked Friar Francis, holding the crucifix on its lance. Those at the back dropped farther and farther behind until at last they gave up and were seen no more. The blinding heat affected the women in their heavy dresses. There were 15 of them. As their money ran out or their husbands died, they were forced to walk. It was thought that they would die almost immediately, but they stripped themselves to their shifts and made padded foot coverings from their dresses and kept up as strongly as the men. 6 weeks from the coast, Dom Bernardhim de Cavallo, can't say his name, damn it. Bernardhim de Cavallo, who had weighed more than 300 pounds at the time of the wreck, but who now weighed considerably less, was asked for more money by the men who were carrying him. "We agreed the price," he said, wiping the sweat from his face, where it immediately reformed. "You are too heavy," one said. "I grow lighter. We grow weaker. Give me your coat. Nothing more." They left him. He did not beg, but sat in the heat of the sun as they trailed past him. "Goodbye. Go with God," he said to each of them. The night Barreto was missing. When he returned to the campfire, Dom Manuel saw he was wearing the brocade coat with the glass buttons. Each day, someone died, most now of starvation or scurvy, or both. The main diet was yellowfish and barbel, which they caught in the river, but Barreto had made this his monopoly, and he sold his catch to the highest bidder. Others looked for snakes or berries or roots. Sometimes they found melons and wild onions, and once they found the half-eaten body of a baboon. All along their road they had company. It was possible to estimate where the rear of the column was by the circling vultures. Leopards had been wary at first, only coming to dead bodies, but later, as they grew bolder, they began to kill off the stragglers. By the end of winter all the women were dead, and only a handful of the strongest men survived. Even the sailors who had had the pick of the food were diminished in numbers because of disease. Of those now remaining, the strongest were Dom Manuel de Sa, Bartolomeo Barreto, and Friar Francis of the Rosary, who still carried the crucifix high on the lance and kept his Bible in its leather pouch slung over his shoulder. He had not been parted from either since they left the beach. "What do you write?" Barreto had asked him one evening soon after they had begun the march. "Our chronicle," he had replied. He was a tall man with sunken cheeks and burning eyes and a brown habit stained and torn from the journey, which reached down to thin but unyielding calves. The Bible and the crucifix were the only things he had saved from the sea. The Bible had been wrapped first in oiled cloth and then buttoned into the leather satchel. so sea water had been unable to get into it. And he wrote his chronicle on the blank tops and bottoms of each page, using a mixture of wood ash and water as his ink and the wing feather of an osprey for his pen.
Ah,
Everything, Barrett asked, drawing the brocade coat around him against the cold. Everything. The friar and the captain had become friends during the past months, each finding in the other a different strength. They watched Barreto as he turned away. He carried his money in leather body belts, which, even in the hottest weather, he had never taken off. Be careful, father, Don Manuel said to the friar. He is dangerous. So are the leopards and the snakes. We must put our trust in God. Winter was over, and the first burning hot days of spring had come. No rain had fallen in the desert for nearly a year. Occasionally, the sky would darken, but instead of rain, wind storms would come, blowing dust in great eddies. Now, only three survivors followed the almost dry river: Friar Francis, Don Manuel, and Barreto. One day, Friar Francis picked up a shiny stone in the riverbed about the size of a child's fist and roughly oblong in shape. It appeared to be some kind of quartz or dull glass. He showed it to Don Manuel. God has been kind to you, the captain said, holding the stone in his trembling hand. I have seen such stones in India straight from the mine, but never a tenth of the size. This is a diamond, father, but such a diamond. Barreto moved closer to hear. What will you do with it, father? Don Manuel asked. What should I do? It is only a stone. It is man's vanity that makes such things wanted. Father, it is worth millions. I know the trade. Friar Francis thought for a while, and then said, I shall build a shrine to Our Lady if what you say is true. Friar Francis and Don Manuel shared a cooking fire at night, but Barreto kept to his own about 40 paces away. It was a strange interdependence. He did not wish to be one with them, but could not strike out on his own. He would sit at his fire staring at them through the darkness as the monk used the firelight to write in his Bible. Sometimes when Don Manuel or the friar woke in the night, they would see him hunched over the embers, his face turned towards them. Food became more difficult to obtain. In their weakened state, the trapping of fish was almost too much for them. Instead, they would look for snakes or frogs or eggs. All were suffering from scurvy. Their teeth had loosened, and their gums were purple. Late one afternoon, Don Manuel returned from a foraging expedition. In his absence, Friar Francis had collected wood and built a fire. They shared the tasks, though Don Manuel did the harder work of the two to make up for the effort which the monk put into his chronicle. It had become a vital document for both men, but especially for Don Manuel, who wished to see Barreto hanged. That afternoon, Don Manuel had found 3 ducks' eggs. They would bury them in the sand, rake the embers over them, and cook them in their shells. As he came along the riverbed in the dusk, he saw Friar Francis kneeling at prayer before the upright lance, but the crucifix was missing. The captain hurried. The monk had been killed at his prayers. He had been stabbed in the back, and his head had fallen forward against the shaft of the lance, so he had remained in a kneeling position. Before animals could mutilate the body, Don Manuel buried it in the sandy bed of the river and covered it with stones. He took the lance, for he had no other weapon, moved half a league away, and kept watch all night. In the morning he found Barretto's footprints in the sand and began to follow them. One thing now remained in his mind: to kill Barreto and somehow save the Chronicle. It was all there was to show that more than 300 people had come to this country and died. Of the diamond he thought very little. He was too far gone for fantasies of wealth. All that day and all the next he followed the footprints. Because of the drought, there was more sand in the riverbed than water. Barreto moved heavily, each step an effort. He knew that Dom Manuel was following him, and for the first time in his life he was afraid. He had killed Friar Francis on impulse because of the diamond. The Chronicle had no meaning for him since he could not read or write and therefore valued words as nothing. He had taken the crucifix and flung it into the deepest pool of the river. Then he had become afraid and had been unable to destroy the Bible because he was conscious of having attacked what was God's. He carried the book with him and it helped to weigh him down. As well, he was worried by the weight of all his belts of money: the heavy coat, the cutlass, the musket, and the pistol. The diamond also helped to weigh him down. He had put it in his pocket and there forgotten it. He did not recognize his own weariness, for his thoughts were on the man who was following him. If he could kill the captain, he could make a plan. He would not go to Lourenço Marquis. He had heard sailors' tales of black kingdoms where, if one had riches, one could live like a king oneself with a dozen black wives and herds of cattle. He decided to circle back and come into the river behind Dom Manuel. The hunter would be the hunted. He moved away from the river into a landscape broken by low hills and black rocks. The heat was terrible. He lay up during the day on the far side of a hill, thinking to re-enter the river bed by night. But in the afternoon the sky turned grey and a violent wind began to blow clouds of sand. He could not see 10 paces ahead of him. He returned to his hiding place up among the black rocks and waited for the sandstorm to blow over. But in the morning it raged as fiercely as ever. He had made a water sack from the intestine of an antelope whose newly killed carcass he had found some weeks before, but there was not much left in it. He decided he would have to go back to the river. He pushed out into the wind, the brocade coat flapping like a sail, the sand lashing his face and eyes. He had to use his hands to save them. The sand grains swarmed about him like gnats, driving him mad. He whirled this way and that, but there was no escape. He flung down the musket, covered his face, and staggered on towards the river. But soon he came to the slope of another hill and knew this could not be the way. He turned, looking through the chinks he made in his fingers. Black rocks loomed up so that bushes and trees, but he could not see the outline of the hill he had left. He wandered on, and soon he was lost. He would have to stop and take shelter and try again later. Perhaps the wind would die at evening and he could reach water. He plowed on, looking for an outcrop of rock, picking his way between camel-thorn trees that were lashing their branches in the wind. On the edge of his vision, something moved laterally, a solid sideways movement, upright, a rock moving in the driven sand. Suddenly, he was face to face with Dom Manuel. The captain had followed his tracks out of the riverbed and into the broken hills, but then he too had been overwhelmed by the storm. Now, with a cry that sounded above the roaring of the wind, he raised the lance and ran forward. Barreto had no time to draw his pistol and prime it. He grabbed for his cutlass, but the coat flapped and covered the handle, and by the time he had grasped it, Dom Manuel was upon him and the lance had gone through his shoulder. He swung the cutlass at Don Manuel's neck, severing the great artery, and the captain fell, spouting blood like a sow. Barreto pulled the lance from his shoulder and tried to staunch the wound, but the blood dripped down steadily. The captain was dead. Barreto was alive, but he would only stay alive if he reached the river. He caught up the lance and plunged into the driving wall of sand. He knew he never knew how far he walked. That day passed, and then a night, and half of the following day, and so he went on. The wind had dropped. The sand was still. The only thing that moved in the burning landscape was Barreto himself. He staggered, stopping sometimes to lean on the lance. The wound had become poisoned, and the poison was affecting his mind. He thought he was being followed, but when he turned, there was no one. Later, as coherent thought died, he began to have hallucinations. Figures loomed towards him, becoming bigger and bigger until they grew up into the heavens and disappeared. They were the figures of Don Manuel and Friar Francis of the Rosary. He stumbled on, muttering and shouting to himself. He aimed his pistol at one of the figures and fired. He dropped the gun and went on. Later he flung his lance at Friar Francis, only to see it strike a black rock. He left it. Then, in his madness, he flung away his body belts. He clung only to the Bible as though his life depended on it. Above him, a pair of white-backed vultures slowly circled, waiting for him to die. Behind him came a leopard waiting for him to grow weak enough to kill. Behind the leopard came a silver-backed jackal, and behind the jackal, a pair of bat-eared foxes. Barreto's great strength gave way. He stumbled and fell, pulled himself up, went on, fell again. He came to a mud hole containing water. He slithered forward into the mud to drink, and the leopard attacked. He saw it only as a shadow. He rose on his knees. It sprang from his left side, knocking him into the mud. It stood for a moment, watching him. In one last desperate act, his fingers closed on Friar Francis' diamond, and he threw it at the leopard's face. The leopard jerked away, and the stone fell into the mud. Then the animal came at him again and disemboweled him, ripping away his clothing to get at his flesh. When it had eaten its fill, it drank and moved off. The jackal and the bat-eared foxes fed. So did the vultures. By evening, the ants were moving in to devour what was left of Barreto. More than 250 years would pass before the diamond came into human contact again. During that time, North America was colonized, Australia discovered, Marie Antoinette lost her head, and Charles Darwin sailed in the Beagle. The world was a very different place, and so was Southern Africa. Okay. Okay. Hoo-wee. Okay. And that is the end. Oh, I got a headache. Oh, man. How many pages? We got 501 pages. It's gonna take some time, but we shall read. For now, I got a headache, so I'm gonna end the stream.